In this video, we're going to be talking about another method for solving quadratic equations, and that is by completing the square. We're going to start out with some warm-ups that are actually already perfect square trinomials. So let's remind you, a perfect square trinomial, here's the test. If you can take the b term, take half of it, and square it, which would be 7 times 7, which is 49, and that's equal to this times this, then therefore this is a perfect square trinomial. What that means is when you factor it, when we go to factor this, we're going to get x times x, adds multiplies will be a positive 7 and a positive 7, so we could just write as x plus 7 squared. So that's a perfect square trinomial. Now once I factor this, look what I've got. X plus 7 squared equals 4. Now what I can do is I can get rid of that square by going to the other side and doing plus and minus the square root of 4. Which is x plus 7 is equal to positive or negative 2. In the last step, we're now going to move this over, and I now have x is equal to, when you move 7 over, it becomes negative 7. I'm always going to write that first, just to make it look better. So now I have two answers, and you can see your two answers, negative 7 plus 2, which is a negative 5, or negative 7 minus 2, which is a negative 9. And that's how you can solve these by using perfect square trinomials. Number 2, let's do the same thing. Half of negative 6 is negative 3. When you square it, gives you 9. So therefore, this is a perfect square trinomial. Factors into x times x is x squared. Now, this second part of your factoring, it always factors into, think about it, what adds to give you negative 6 and multiplies to give you 9. You take half of this and square it, and it gives you this. So what adds to give you negative 6 will always be half of that middle term, which is negative 3. And you can check that when you multiply negative 3 times negative 3, it also gives you that 9. So now let's get rid of the square by square rooting. So now you have x minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 20. Let's go ahead and clean that up. That'll be x minus 3 equals plus and minus the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, which will be 2 root 5. You can move the minus 3 over by adding 3, and you can't really combine those, so let's just leave it like that. Okay, now let's actually go through the process. Now, my process is a little bit different from the way they do it. So I don't think I'm going to go through these steps. I'm just going to start solving these. But it is possible to take any quadratic equation, create a perfect square trinomial like you saw in the warm-ups, and solve it in a similar way. This method is called completing the square. Now, the first thing we do need to do is make sure that we're written in this form. With my method, I take this plus 56 and I always move it over. So x squared minus 18x, take your positive 56, put it on the other side with a 0. My next step is I'm going to complete the square. What that means is I'm going to take this middle term, I'm going to take half of it by dividing by 2, and that's going to be negative 9, and I'm going to square that. Negative 18 divided by 2 is negative 9, squared would be a positive 81. Add that to both sides. What you just did was you created, just like in the warm-ups, you created a perfect square trinomial right here. Because half of this times itself gives you that. So therefore, when you go to factor this, it'll always factor into a perfect square. X times x, and the rest of it, what adds to give you this and multiplies to give you this, would be a negative 9 and a negative 9. Again, once you factor, it'll always factor into half of this middle term. Now on the other side, we can combine those. Negative 56 and 81 gives you 25. And now it's just like our warm-ups. To get rid of a square, we go to the other side and we do plus and minus the square root. Square root of 25 is 5. Last step, move the 9 over, so you now have x equals 9 plus and minus 5. Always write that, combine those if you can. 9 plus 5 is a 14. 9 minus 5 is 4, so therefore x is equal to 14 and 4. Next problem. Now here, if it's possible, go through and every term can be divided by 2. Clean that up first if you can. So you now have x squared minus 8x equals negative 15. Now, should I move this over here? Well, think about the way I work it. I always move that constant term over anyway, so actually you can just leave it on the right side. Now, let's talk about completing the square. You're going to take your b term, take half of it, which you do so by dividing by 2, and you're going to square it. Negative 8 divided by 2 is negative 4. Squared is a positive 16. This will always be a positive value. You're going to add that value to both sides. You have created a perfect square on the left side. You always factor once you complete the square. X times itself gives you x squared. Adds, multiplies will be a negative 4 times a negative 4, which again is half of that negative 8. On the right side, always combine those. Negative 15 and 16 is 1. To get rid of a square, we square root, so we're going to do plus and minus the square root of 1, which is 1. Move the 4 over, so you have negative 4 becomes a positive 4, plus and minus 1. So your two answers, x is equal to 4 plus 1, which is 5, and 4 minus 1, which is 3. Next problem. Number 5. There's a problem here. This doesn't, we can't divide everything by 4. Because this, yes, but no here. So here's what you're going to do now. You can start out, you can move the 3 over, but it's senseless with my method. First thing, if you have a number in front of x squared, that number must be factored out. We're going to have to take that left side and we're going to have to factor out a 4. That's going to leave you with an x squared and a minus 2x. Now here's where this gets a little bit complicated, but it's still not hard. We're going to complete our square inside of here. We're going to take half of this, negative 2, we're going to take half of it and we're going to square it. That's going to be negative 1 squared, which is a positive 1. We're going to add that to both sides. Well, be careful. Because if you look at the left side, you did not add 1 to the left side. You added 1 inside of parentheses. If you were to take and multiply this back out, how much did you add to the left side? You added 4 times 1. So since you added 4 times 1 to the left side, then you must add 4 times 1 to the right side, which is 4. Now, do the same thing. We're going to take our 4, bring it down. We're going to factor our perfect square trinomial. It's always going to be a square. What adds to give you negative 2, multiplies to give you a positive 1 is negative 1 and negative 1, which is, again, always half of that. Negative 3 plus 4 gives you 1. Now what do? The number that you factored out, I'm moving to the other side. Since it's being multiplied, I can move it to the other side by dividing. Now, x minus 1, to get rid of a square, we're going to do plus and minus the square root. To square root a fraction, you square at the top and you square at the bottom. You move the 1 over, negative 1 becomes a positive 1. So here are your two answers. X equals, and you can find a common denominator if you want to. You can do 1 is the same thing as 1 over 1, multiply top and bottom by 2, gives you 2 over 2. So 2 over 2 plus 1 over 2, which will be a 3 over 2. And a 2 over 2 minus 1 over 2, which is a 1 over 2. There's your two answers. Number 6. 3x squared plus 10x plus 8. Again, the first thing that I do is I move my plus 8 over. So that's going to become a negative 8. Now this one's going to be a little bit ugly. If there's a number out front, it must be factored. And you might be sitting here thinking, wait a minute, you can't factor a 3 out of 10. And not to give yourself a whole number, you can't. But we've got to ask ourselves, in order to get something here, 3 times what? What in the world will give you a 10? Now watch this. If you were to multiply 3 times what to give me a 10, if you were to multiply 3 times 10 thirds, look what happens. The 3's would actually cancel and it would give you that 10. So we've got to multiply by something that would force that 3 to cancel, which would be a 10 third. And you can check that. If you were to multiply that back out, 3 times x squared will give you 3x squared. 3 times 10 thirds, the 3 and 3 would cancel and would give you 10x. Okay, now let's go through the process. Here we go. We must now complete the square. This is as hard as they'll get right here. We must complete the square. In order to complete the square, we take our 10 thirds and we half it. How do you half a fraction? You multiply it by a half. Then we're going to take and we're going to square that, and that's going to be what we add. So half of 10 thirds, we can cross cancel. That's a 1 and that's a 5. That would be 5 thirds. We've got to square it. That is a positive 25 over 9. That's what we're going to add to both sides. However, we did not add a 25 ninths to the left side. We added 3 times 25/9 to the left side. So in order to find out what to add to the right side, I'm going to have to do 3 times 25/9. Cross cancel, that gives you a 1 and a 3. That is 25/3. That is what you're going to add to the right side. Okay, now let's see what we can do with this. Bring down the 3. We've got to factor this. How in the world do you factor that ugly stuff? It's actually pretty easy. It's a perfect square. And remember what I've been telling you on every other problem. How do you factor this? What does it always factor into? It will always factor into what half of this was. So remember where you took half of it? That's going to factor into x plus 5/3 squared. Equals, now on the other side, we need a common denominator. Let's multiply top and bottom by 3. Gives you a 24/3. So negative 24/3 plus 25/3 gives you 1/3. Now we're getting somewhere. Let's move the 3 over. Since it's being multiplied, we got to divide. So how in the world do you divide by 3? You flip and multiply. So to get rid of that 3, let's multiply by its reciprocal. So we're going to come over here and do times the reciprocal, which is 1/3. So now you have x plus 5/3 squared equals 1/9. To get rid of a square, you do plus and minus the square root. To square root a fraction, you square at the top, you square at the bottom. Now it's much simpler. Let's move our 5/3 over. So you have x equals negative 5/3 plus and minus 1/3. So that would be x equals negative 5/3 plus 1/3 would be negative 4/3. Negative 5/3 minus 1/3 would be negative 6/3. 6/3, 6 divided by 3, that is 2. So there's your 2 answers. Number 7, back to the easier one now. I don't know why they threw that hard one in there. First thing, I want my x squareds and x's on one side and all my constants to the other side. So let's do x squared plus 16x. When you move your 21 over by adding 21, you get 16. Let's complete our square. To complete your square, you always take this term. We're going to half it, and then we're going to square it. That'll be 8 to the second, which would be a positive 64. You're going to add a 64 here. Since there's no parentheses, you're going to add the same thing to the other side. You always factor, and this is a perfect square if you did it correctly. It's x times x gives you x squared. Adds, multiplies is a positive 8. And again, notice it's always half of this is what it factors into, is equal to 16 and 64, which is 80. To get rid of a square, you do plus and minus the square root of 80. Now let's clean that up. Square root of 80 can be split into root 16 and root 5. So instead of root 80, let's put 4 root 5 to save ourselves a step. We now move the 8 over by doing negative 8, and I like to write it first. These do not combine because you have rational with irrational, and you can't combine those two, so we're just going to leave it. That's your 2 answers, negative 8 plus 4 root 5, negative 8 minus 4 root 5. Now, this could be written as a decimal, and you could get 2 decimal answers, but if they want exact, you're going to have to leave it like that. Okay, next one, notice 3, 30, and 69. You can actually go ahead and clean this up a lot by dividing everything by 3. It's going to be a smart first move, and that's what you now have. The reason that is a smart first move is you don't have to factor out that 3 anymore. So now let's go through and complete the square. To complete the square, you take half of this, which is negative 5, and you square it, which is a positive 25. You'll never get a negative number here to add to both sides because you're always going to take half and then multiply it times itself. A negative times a negative even would be a positive, as in this case. We're going to complete our square, and now we're going to factor. X times x gave me the x squared. What adds, multiplies is a negative 5 and a negative 5, which again is half of that, is equal to, this would be a 48 on the other side. To get rid of a square, we're going to do plus and minus the square root of 48. Let's split that. That'd be root 16 times root 3, which is 4 root 3. So let's write that instead. Now simply move your 5 over. Negative 5 becomes a positive 5, and you are finished. We're not going to combine those. We're going to leave it as 5 plus and minus 4 root 3. The next one. Move the constant over, x squared plus 12x. 43 becomes a negative 43. Complete the square. The way we complete the square, half of it multiplied times itself gives you a 36. Add that to both sides, and something different is going to happen this time. This is a perfect square now. X times itself, adds, multiplies, positive 6, which is half of that, equals negative 43 plus 36 is a negative 7. And you might already seeing what's about to happen. X plus 6 equals plus and minus. To get rid of a square, you're going to plus and minus square root. You get the square root of negative 7, which is an imaginary number. Split it into root negative 1 times root 7. So that's going to be x plus 6 equals plus and minus I root 7. To move the 6 over, we're going to change it to negative 6. So our answer is going to be negative 6 plus and minus, that's two different answers, I root 7. That's going to be your two complex answers. And the last one. Again, everything is divisible by 4, so we have x squared plus 19 equals 4x. That's always a great first move when you're solving any type of equation. If you ever have an equation to where everything's divisible by something, why not reduce it just like you would a fraction? Let's move all of our x's to one side. So 4x becomes negative 4x. Move your 19 to the other side by subtracting. Complete the square by taking half of negative 4 and squaring it. Gives you a positive 4. Add that to both sides. We are now going to factor this perfect square. X times itself, adds, multiplies, negative 2, which is half of negative 4. On the other side, negative 19 and 4 is a negative 15. Let's get rid of a square by doing plus and minus the square root. That can be split into root negative 1 times root 15. Root 15 does not clean up anymore. So you now have x minus 2 equals, and I'm going to leave a space here to save ourselves a step. That's going to be I root 15. To get rid of minus 2, you're going to move to the other side, and it's going to be plus 2. And x is now by itself. There's your two answers.